In the golden glow of the restaurant's chandeliers, laughter and arrogance filled the air. The billionaire CEO leaned close to his companion, whispering mockery in French, certain the young waitress nearby was nothing more than silent background. But her steady eyes told another story. With a calm yet defiant voice, she answered him fluently, turning the entire room into stunned silence. What unfolded next would not only shatter his pride, but reveal a truth no fortune could ever hide. And before we begin, let me wish you health and peace. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? At the top of Aspen Mountain, beneath the glittering Christmas lights, Jonathan Pierce seemed to have it all, yet he had no idea that this dinner would change his life forever. Jonathan Pierce, 55 years old, stepped into the grand lobby of the Little Nell Hotel with the composure of a man who had negotiated thousands of deals. Outside, the Colorado winter bit hard, snow covering the streets in thick white blankets. But inside the hotel, warmth-rained candles flickered on polished tables, soft Christmas jazz drifted from the speakers, and garlands of red and green hung along the hallway. Families gathered around their dinners, children laughed, and the savory aroma of prime rib filled the air. And still, within all that holiday comfort, Jonathan walked with a cold face, sharp eyes that cut like glass, and the heavy breathing of a man far too accustomed to loneliness. He slipped off his long black overcoat, handed it to the attendant, and strode straight toward the private dining room already reserved in his name. A server opened the door, bowed politely. "Good evening, Mr. Pierce." Jonathan gave a short nod, barely more than a grunt, and took his seat at a leather chair by the window, the snowy peaks rising dark and silent outside. The strands of twinkling lights strung across the town below meant nothing to him. To Jonathan, they were simply decoration, commercial sparkle to lure in holiday tourists. Soon, Thomas Bradley arrived. At 47, he wore a Navy suit and carried himself with the distracted air of a man whose phone was his true companion. He apologized, breathless. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was insane with all the holiday skiers." Jonathan smirked, half amused, half dismissive. "Aspen is always crowded this time of year, Tom. Crowds mean business, and business means money." The two sat down, slipping easily into the rhythm of numbers and projections. Their conversation spun around a new venture, expanding the luxury resort chain into Montana. Jonathan's voice was measured but calculating, laying out how land could be bought cheaply, how markets could be captured, how profits would double. Thomas nodded often, tossing in flattery like chips into a pot. Each one meant to remind Jonathan of his dominance. A young waitress approached, balancing a tray of Bordeaux. She set the glass carefully in front of Jonathan. He glanced at her shoes, scuffed from long shifts, the heels worn thin, and waved his hand as though brushing away a fly. "Make sure it's the 2015, not the 2016, he muttered, never looking her in the eye. Thomas chuckled, leaning in. "You're picky as always, John." Jonathan's reply was smooth, cutting. "That's why I'm on top, Tom. Details matter. People? They don't." The words fell heavy, cold as the snow piling up outside. At nearby tables, families raised their glasses to toast the season. Children curled into their parents' arms, their giggles blending with the music. Yet here, at the center table, there was nothing but profit margins and property rights. No mention of children, no laughter, no warmth. An unseen narrator might have noticed the contrast. One side of the dining room brimmed with ordinary joy, while at Jonathan's table sat power wrapped in ice. He sipped his wine, eyes locked on the draft contract before him, muttering inwardly, "No distractions. Family ties only slow you down." For 3 decades, he had lived by that creed. And it was that creed that led him to this night, a night that would unravel the very foundation of his carefully built world. The waiter returned with menus, though Jonathan hardly glanced at his. He already knew what he wanted: rack of lamb, cooked medium rare, paired with another bottle of Bordeaux. Routine was his comfort, predictability his armor. Thomas, on the other hand, skimmed the menu nervously, then ordered a ribeye and a glass of bourbon. The exchange felt transactional, just as every meal Jonathan shared with business associates did. Food was fuel, not memory, and company was merely a means to an end. Yet as he waited, Something about the atmosphere pressed against Jonathan's cold resolve. The restaurant buzzed with a different kind of energy than the sterile boardrooms he inhabited. In the far corner, a group of retirees in Christmas sweaters clinked their glasses, their cheeks rosy from laughter. Near the fireplace, a young couple exchanged gifts, the woman's eyes welling with happy tears as she unwrapped a small silver locket. Even the staff moved with a sense of community, servers passing trays to one another with whispered jokes, the bartender giving a wink to a busboy as he poured eggnog for a family at the bar. Jonathan noticed, but only to scoff inwardly. He muttered under his breath, "Sentiment. A waste of time." Thomas caught it and laughed politely, though the sound carried a hollow echo. Their meals arrived, and Jonathan carved into the lamb with precision, speaking between bites. He outlined strategies for cutting costs and staffing, even mentioning how fewer benefits could save millions annually. Thomas nodded, though his eyes darted toward the waitress who served them, her hands slightly trembling under the weight of a heavy tray. There was no empathy in Jonathan's gaze, only critique. "Sloppy service," he remarked in French, assuming no one around him would care or understand. Thomas chuckled, but uneasily, shifting in his seat. Outside, the snow fell heavier, flakes swirling under the glow of the street lamps. The muffled sound of church bells drifted in from across town, announcing the evening mass. For many in Aspen, it was a reminder of faith, family, and gathering. For Jonathan, it was merely background noise, like the hum of an air conditioner. He had no plans to step into a church, no family to meet at home. His penthouse suite at the top of the hotel awaited silent, spotless, and empty. The narrator's voice, if it could be heard, might have leaned gently toward the audience now. "Folks, you see, wealth can buy walls of glass and towers of stone, but it cannot buy the warmth of a child's laughter or the comfort of a shared prayer on a snowy night." Jonathan dabbed his lips with a linen napkin, already bored with the evening. He glanced at Thomas, who looked eager to please, but tired of dancing in his shadow. "Let's wrap this up," Jonathan said firmly. "Tomorrow we'll finalize the numbers. Tonight is just a formality." Thomas raised his bourbon in a half-hearted toast to success. Jonathan clinked his wine glass without even looking up. And then, the smallest of details so ordinary it could have been overlooked began to shape the night ahead. The young waitress returned, her tray balanced carefully as she refilled Jonathan's glass. For a brief moment, her sleeve slipped back, and a silver chain glimmered around her neck. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward it without thought, catching only the faint outline of a pendant resting against her collar. Something stirred, faint but unsettling, like a memory tugging from far away. He brushed it off quickly, telling himself it was nothing. He had no use for memories. The past was buried, and he had built an empire precisely by refusing to look back. Yet the image lingered, clinging to the edges of his mind as the snow thickened outside. Across the room, laughter swelled again, a chorus of joy that seemed to mock the emptiness at Jonathan's table. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing, as if daring the world to challenge him. For decades, no one had. He believed no one ever would. But the night had other plans. He didn't know that the young woman standing quietly at his side, balancing a tray of wine and dishes, carried more than just plates and glasses. She carried a story. She carried a past. And in her presence lay the truth Jonathan had spent half a lifetime avoiding. He had no way of knowing, as he lifted his glass once more, that the next words spoken at this table would begin to unravel the fortress of power he had built. He didn't know that the next chapter of his life had already walked into the room. He didn't know that the next server approaching his table was the very thread tying him back to the past he thought was gone forever. He had no idea. He had no idea at all. He had no idea that the next server approaching his table was the very thread tying him back to the past he thought was gone forever. He had no idea. He had no idea at all. He had no idea that the next server approaching his table was the very thread tying him back to the past he thought was gone forever. He had no idea. He had no idea at all. The private dining room carried the low hum of clinking glasses and hushed conversations, but Jonathan Pierce hardly noticed. For him, the evening was a blur of numbers and projections. The chatter of holiday cheer, little more than static in the background. Yet across the room, another story was quietly unfolding. Grace Turner balanced a tray of crystal glasses with steady hands. She had worked long hours all season, ski tours kept the resort busy, and Christmas meant no rest for staff. Her shoes bore the marks of endless shifts, the leather scuffed at the toes, but her uniform was pressed crisp. She had learned long ago that presentation mattered. Even when money was scarce, even when exhaustion ached in her bones, she walked with dignity. As she approached Jonathan's table, she caught a glimpse of herself reflected in the polished window behind him. A young woman with auburn hair pinned neatly, eyes alert, yet tired, and around her neck, a silver pendant that had never left her side, her mother's necklace. Grace touched it lightly with her free hand before setting down the glasses. Jonathan didn't lift his gaze. "Make sure this wine breathes," he muttered, his French accent deliberately exaggerated. He leaned toward Thomas and added in French, "Even the staff should know better than to stumble around like barn animals." Grace's heart tightened, but her face remained neutral. Years of practice had taught her how to smile politely while the words of wealthy patrons cut like knives. She had cleaned tables after Wall Street bankers sneered at her. She had served drinks while celebrities joked that she must have taken the wrong audition. But Jonathan's tone tonight carried something sharper, something that struck deeper, though she couldn't yet name why. Thomas chuckled, though awkwardly. "Come on, John. She's just doing her job." Jonathan waved a hand dismissively. "Details matter, Tom, and sloppiness shows." Grace stepped back, tray tucked under her arm, and inhaled slowly. She understood every word. Her mother had been a linguist, a woman who once taught French at a community college before illness cut her life short. Grace had grown up surrounded by textbooks, lullabies, whispered in different tongues, lessons folded into bedtime stories. She never flaunted that knowledge. Life as a waitress left little space for pride, but she carried it, quietly, like the pendant at her throat. At a table nearby, a tourist aimed her phone at her plate, recording for an audience somewhere far away. The glow of the camera light caught the pendant around Grace's neck for an instant, making it glimmer like a signal flare. Jonathan didn't notice. He was too busy smirking at his own wit, sipping his wine as though it proved his superiority. The air in the room shifted slightly. A couple at another table turned their heads toward Jonathan's laugh. A man in a wool sweater frowned, shaking his head at the CEO's arrogance. Grace felt the weight of the room pressing against her shoulders. She wanted to walk away, to let the insults slide as she always did. Yet something inside her whispered, "Not tonight." She steadied the tray against her hip, her thumb brushing the cool silver of her necklace once more. Her mother's words echoed faintly in memory. "Grace, language is power. Don't ever forget that." And though she lowered her gaze respectfully, her mind burned with quiet defiance. She would not let herself be invisible forever. The waitress moved gracefully through the room, balancing plates of roasted duck and lamb medallions with the precision of a dancer. Her shifts had trained her body to remember the weight, the angles, the way to avoid collisions, even when trays pressed heavy against her palms. Yet inside, her thoughts whirled. Every sharp word from Jonathan sat heavy, not because she was unused to disdain, but because something about his presence felt painfully familiar, like a shadow from the past she could not yet see clearly. Jonathan leaned closer to Thomas, speaking again in French, but this time louder, for others to hear. "Look at her shoes. Worn. She doesn't belong here." His smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, confident that his performance of superiority was unassailable. Thomas laughed uneasily, eyes darting around the room. He had always been a man who preferred comfort over conflict, and he was beginning to sense the discomfort building at nearby tables. Grace steadied her breath. She told herself to keep moving, to let the insults roll off like snow from a roof. But her hand brushed against the silver necklace again, and the memory of her mother's soft voice came rushing back. Bedtime stories told in French, songs in Italian, whispered phrases in Spanish. Her mother had once said that languages were bridges between people, and that someday Grace would find herself standing on one of those bridges. The necklace glimmered in the candlelight as she bent to place another plate on the table. A guest at the next table noticed, tilting her head. "That's a beautiful pendant," the woman whispered to her companion. Grace caught the words, offered a small smile, and moved on. Jonathan's smirk widened as if he had scored a victory. He lifted his glass toward Thomas. "You see, Tom, people like her are invisible. They serve, we consume. That's the order of things." Grace's grip tightened on the tray. She wanted to speak, to cut through the arrogance, but the timing wasn't right. Instead, she placed a final glass down in front of Thomas with perfect steadiness. Her silence was not surrender, it was preparation. The room seemed to sense the tension. Conversations quieted just slightly. Phones angled subtly toward the table. A businessman near the window pretended to check his messages while actually recording. In the age of digital eyes, arrogance was never as private as Jonathan assumed. Grace took a small step back, her figure framed against the tall window where snow fell in endless sheets outside. The reflection showed her standing tall, tray at her side, necklace catching the glow of the chandeliers. She looked almost like a figure out of time, someone who had walked in from another world, carrying a truth no one else yet knew. Her gaze flicked briefly toward Jonathan, though he didn't notice. He was too busy admiring his own cleverness, too wrapped in the cocoon of wealth and ego he had spun around himself. Grace exhaled slowly, steadying herself. Tonight, she promised silently, would not end the same way so many others had. Tonight, she would not swallow her dignity. And in that quiet vow, the story of the evening began to shift. On her chest, the silver pendant shimmered again, brighter this time, as though it carried the memory of the woman who had given it to her, and the unspoken link between past and present. Jonathan reached for his wine, raising it to his lips, utterly unaware. At that very moment, the strands of fate had already begun to tighten. On Grace's neck, the silver chain glistened in the candlelight, the same necklace Jonathan Pierce would soon recognize as a piece of his own past. The cliffhanger settled like a hush across the room. On Grace's neck, the silver chain glimmered in the candlelight, the very piece that would force Jonathan to face a truth he thought long buried. The dining room was alive with the sound of cutlery, clinking glasses, and murmured conversation. Yet it felt as if the air itself shifted when Grace returned to Jonathan's table. A subtle silence spread, like the calm before a storm. The weight of his earlier insults still lingered, echoing in her ears. For a moment, she considered doing what she had always done, smile politely, turn away, and let the powerful man bask in his arrogance. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the words pressed against her chest, demanding release. Jonathan leaned toward Thomas, his voice low but clear enough for others to hear. "In French," he remarked, "she moves as if stomping through a barn. No refinement, no grace." He smirked at his own wordplay, as if the irony of her name amused him. Thomas chuckled nervously, though his eyes flicked toward Grace with the faintest trace of discomfort. Grace paused, tray in hand. She lifted her gaze and met Jonathan's eyes for the first time that evening. The room seemed to contract around them, conversations dimming as diners sensed the current of something unusual. Grace's lips parted, and in flawless French she replied, her tone calm but pointed, "If you wish to critique my service, sir, you might consider using proper grammar. Your subjunctive was incorrect." The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. Ripples spread instantly. Heads turned. A man in a wool coat raised his brows in astonishment. A woman in pearls leaned forward, whispering to her companion. Even Thomas froze, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Jonathan blinked, his smirk faltering. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, someone had pierced the armor of his superiority, not with anger, not with defiance, but with precision. His jaw tightened, and he switched languages, testing her. In Italian, he muttered, "A waitress pretending to be a scholar. How amusing." Grace's answer was immediate, her Italian smooth, unhurried, elegant. "Cleverness is not measured by title, sir. It is measured by understanding, and perhaps yours could use a touch more polish." She allowed a faint smile, her eyes steady. Gasps rippled through the room. A guest near the fireplace lowered his phone, his intention to record replaced by sheer awe. Another diner, a retired professor visiting Aspen for the holidays, murmured, "Her accent is better than his." Jonathan's fingers drummed against the table, his composure slipping. He looked around quickly, realizing too many eyes were now watching. But Grace didn't flinch. She stood tall, tray tucked neatly under her arm, her voice carrying with quiet strength. At a nearby table, a young child tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mommy, she speaks like my teacher." The mother smiled softly, nodding, her eyes fixed on Grace with admiration. Jonathan tried again, this time in English, his tone sharp. "You think this matters? You're still just the help." His words sounded louder than he intended, echoing through the dining room. But the bite was gone. The arrogance rang hollow, and those who listened knew it. Grace's hands tightened around the tray, but her voice remained steady. "I understand more than you believe, and that is what matters." The atmosphere thickened. Guests leaned closer, their dinners forgotten, their attention fixed entirely on the strange magnetic standoff unfolding before them. Even Thomas, usually eager to bolster Jonathan, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between the two with growing unease. Grace inhaled deeply, steadying herself once more. She had spent years swallowing her dignity, years living in the shadows of wealth and indifference. But not tonight. Tonight, her mother's lessons rose within her like a tide, and she would not be silenced. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Even the fireplace crackled softer, as though it too listened to the unlikely duel unfolding between a billionaire and a waitress. Grace stood perfectly still, her back straight, her chin slightly lifted, tray tucked firmly under her arm. She was no longer just a server in a black uniform. She had become something else in the eyes of the room. A voice, clear and steady, challenging power without raising her volume. Jonathan's smirk twisted into a strained laugh. Switching back to French, he attempted once more to seize control. Perhaps she learned a few phrases from a tourist handbook. Nothing more. Grace's reply was sharp, flawless, and resonant. "I learned from someone far greater than a handbook, sir. From someone who believed words could build bridges rather than walls." She paused just long enough for the silence to stretch. "And it seems you prefer walls." Whispers broke out at the tables surrounding them. A man in a velvet blazer whispered to his wife, "She's remarkable." The wife nodded, her eyes wide. Finally, someone told him off. Across the room, a group of college students applauded softly, though they quickly quieted, not wanting to draw attention to themselves. Jonathan's jaw clenched. He had not expected resistance, much less resistance that dismantled him with elegance rather than outrage. His wealth, his charm, his practiced airs of superiority, none of it seemed to matter in this moment. He was losing ground, and he knew it. Thomas cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "Maybe we should," he began. But Jonathan cut him off with a dismissive wave, refusing to let go of his dominance. He leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "You think you're clever, don't you? Cleverness doesn't change who you are." Grace's expression softened, but her words cut deeper than any raised voice could. "Cleverness is not what defines me. Integrity island. And tonight, I choose not to let yours diminish mine." The quiet power of her response sent a shiver across the room. A woman in pearls pressed a napkin to her lips, her eyes glistening. At another table, a man muttered, "She reminds me of my daughter." The sentiment spread, rippling through the diners like a collective awakening. For the first time, Jonathan avoided her gaze. His fingers drummed against the table, restless, betraying the cracks in his composure. Grace, on the other hand, seemed calmer now, as though releasing the words had lifted a weight from her chest. In that silence, she reached for a nearby wine bottle, pouring carefully into Thomas's glass. Her hands were steady, her motions graceful. The very thing Jonathan had mocked her supposed clumsiness had become an act of quiet defiance. She moved to Lena's glass, then Jonathan's, setting each gently before them. When she placed the final glass in front of Jonathan, her eyes met his again. For a fleeting second, something passed between them. Not recognition, not yet, but a flicker of unease, as though some buried memory stirred in the shadows of his mind. Then she stepped back, resting the tray against her hip, and for the first time allowed herself a faint smile. Not smug, not triumphant, but serene. The room erupted in hushed whispers. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. Jonathan, the man who always had the last word, had been undone by a young woman's calm precision. Yet in the midst of this transformation, another story quietly emerged. From a few tables away, Margaret Collins Maggie, as most called her, set down her glass of wine. Her eyes had been fixed not only on Grace's words, but on the glint of the pendant resting against her collarbone. Silver, aged, with a design she remembered from long ago. A chill ran through her as recognition dawned. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze narrowing. The necklace? She knew it. The cliffhanger pressed in. Unspoken but heavy, Maggie Collins had begun to connect the pieces, and the necklace around Grace's neck was about to unravel a past Jonathan Pierce thought buried forever. Maggie Collins had seen plenty of business dinners in her life. As an investor, she was no stranger to arrogance dressed in tailored suits or charm that smelled faintly of expensive cologne and cheap promises. But what she had just witnessed at Jonathan Pierce's table was different. It wasn't just a display of ego, it was the slow cracking of a man's mask. Undone not by a rival CEO, but by a young waitress with steady eyes and words sharp as glass. She took a sip of her wine, but her attention was fixed on Grace, specifically on the silver chain that shimmered in the candlelight every time the young woman leaned forward with her tray. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She knew that necklace. She had seen it decades ago, in a different life, around the neck of a dear friend. Her hand trembled slightly as she set her glass down. The sound of it tapping against the table was soft, but to her, it echoed like a bell. Memories came rushing back. Winter nights at college, her roommate laughing as she held up that very necklace, saying it was a gift from a man who promised the world. That man had been Jonathan Pierce. Maggie remembered it clearly, the same design, the same delicate curve in the silver. And now, here it was, resting against the collarbone of a young woman who could only be. Maggie shook the thought from her head, but it clung like smoke. She glanced toward Jonathan. His confident posture seemed a little less steady now, his smirk thinner, his eyes flickering with unease whenever Grace drew near. He hadn't noticed the necklace yet, but Maggie knew it was only a matter of time. At Jonathan's table, Thomas Bradley shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He picked at his food, pretending not to notice the tension, but his shoulders hunched as though bracing for an impact he couldn't predict. Jonathan's fork clinked against his plate, the motion too forceful, betraying his irritation. He leaned back, crossing his arms, trying to reclaim control of the evening. But the silence around him felt heavier with each passing moment. Grace returned with another round of wine. Her steps were steady, her gaze forward. She placed each glass on the table with care, as though every movement were deliberate. When she set Jonathan's glass before him, he finally looked at her not as a servant, but as something he couldn't quite place. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, quickly hidden behind a mask of indifference. But Maggie saw it. She saw everything. The necklace gleamed again as Grace stepped back. Maggie's heart pounded. She couldn't stay silent. Not now. She leaned slightly forward, her voice calm but curious, carrying just enough to reach the young woman. "That's a beautiful necklace," she said. "Where did you get it?" Grace blinked, surprised by the question. For a moment, her lips parted, then closed again as though she debated how much to share. Finally, she spoke softly. "It was my mother's. She said it was given to her long ago, by someone she once trusted with her heart." The words settled like snowflakes on a silent night, light but undeniable. Maggie's throat tightened. She darted a glance toward Jonathan, whose hand froze halfway to his glass. Grace continued, her voice tinged with quiet pride. "My mother wore it until the day she passed. She told me to keep it close, that one day it would matter." The dining room around them buzzed with life, laughter, music, the clatter of silverware, but at Jonathan's table, time seemed to slow. Maggie's eyes stayed on the necklace, on Grace, and then flicked once more to Jonathan. The lines of recognition were already forming, and Maggie knew it was only the beginning. The words hung in the air, heavier than any toast or contract signed that night. Grace had spoken them simply, almost casually, yet Maggie felt the impact strike Jonathan like a hammer blow. Jonathan's hand remained frozen around the stem of his wineglass. The faint tremor in his fingers betrayed what his face tried so desperately to conceal. He forced his lips into a thin smile, but the usual sharpness in his eyes was gone. They darted not at Grace, not at Thomas, but at the pendant now glimmering under the chandeliers as though the light itself had chosen to reveal it. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, trying to steer the moment back to safer ground. "So," he said with a nervous chuckle, "shall we talk about the Montana project figures again?" His voice faltered, for no one was listening. Even nearby diners, pretending to enjoy their meals, were now watching with a hushed fascination. They could sense that something more important than business was taking place at this table. Grace, oblivious to the storm her words had ignited, stood quietly, her tray balanced neatly against her side. Her eyes softened for a moment, remembering her mother. The way she used to hold the necklace between her fingers when she thought no one was watching. The way her voice grew wistful whenever she said, "I once loved a man who gave me this, but promises can be broken, Grace. Don't let them define your worth." Maggie's throat tightened as the memory of her college friend returned with brutal clarity. She remembered the nights when her roommate cried softly into her pillow, the necklace glinting under the dorm's lamplight, the whispered name Jonathan. Maggie had been there. She had known the man was ambitious, charming, but restless, always looking past the present toward the next opportunity. And now, here he sat, older, wealthier, but suddenly stripped of all the arrogance that had carried him here. Jonathan's breathing grew heavier. He tried to steady himself, taking a sip of wine, but the glass rattled against his teeth before he set it down. For years, he had lived in a fortress of denial, convincing himself that the past was buried deep enough never to resurface. But the necklace was proof. The young woman standing before him was living evidence that the past was alive and staring him in the face. Maggie could no longer stay silent. Her voice was low but firm, each word deliberate. "Jonathan, do you remember her?" The question cut like a blade. Jonathan's head snapped toward her, his jaw tight. "Remember who?" he asked, though his voice cracked just slightly. "Your past," Maggie said simply. She glanced at Grace, then back at him. "The woman who wore that necklace before her." Grace looked between them, confusion clouding her expression. You knew my mother?" Jonathan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, struggling to summon words that wouldn't betray him. His empire, his reputation, his carefully constructed identity, suddenly, it all seemed fragile, as delicate as the chain glimmering on Grace's neck. The room was unbearably still. A man at a nearby table paused with his fork in midair. A woman in a velvet shawl whispered to her husband, "Something's happening." The air felt charged, as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen. Jonathan's eyes finally lifted and locked on the necklace. His face, usually unreadable, betrayed a storm shock, denial, grief, recognition, all colliding in a single moment. He knew it. He knew that pendant. He knew what it meant. And in that instant, the mask slipped. The cliffhanger settled with devastating clarity. Jonathan Pierce's gaze clung to the necklace, and in its silver glow, he saw the truth. He had long feared the truth that this young waitress was not a stranger at all. The chandelier above the dining room glowed softly, but for Jonathan Pierce, the light felt blinding. His eyes clung to the pendant around Grace's neck, as if it were a spotlight exposing secrets he had spent decades trying to bury. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, tugging at his cufflinks as though the adjustment could buy him a sliver of composure. Maggie Collins leaned forward, her expression calm but unyielding. She had known this man in another lifetime, back when ambition sparkled in his eyes rather than arrogance. She had seen him charm her friend, the woman who once wore that necklace, and she had seen the heartbreak that followed. Now, as she watched Jonathan falter, she understood that history had circled back, demanding its due. Grace stood nearby, confused by the undercurrent swirling between them. She sensed the tension but didn't understand its depth. Her hand brushed against the pendant, instinctively protective. "It was my mother's," she repeated softly, as if the simple truth of it could anchor her. Jonathan's voice, usually commanding, wavered. What was her name?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Grace blinked, surprised. "Her name was Anna Turner." The sound of it cracked something inside Jonathan. He had not heard that name spoken aloud in years. It carried with it the scent of winters long past, the warmth of a smile he had once thought would last forever. For a moment, his mind betrayed him, pulling him back to a younger version of himself, standing in the snow with Anna's laughter ringing in his ears. Maggie's gaze softened. She reached into her purse with deliberate care, pulling out a worn photograph she had kept tucked away for decades. The edges were frayed, the colors faded, but the image was unmistakable. She slid it across the table, her hand steady. Grace frowned, stepping closer. Jonathan's hand hovered above the photo, trembling before he finally picked it up. The picture showed a young man with dark hair and a confident smile. his arm wrapped around a woman with kind eyes, and the very necklace now shining on Grace's chest. They looked carefree, hopeful, untouched by the burdens of time. Grace gasped softly. "That's my mother." Her eyes widened as she looked from the photograph to Jonathan. The resemblance was undeniable. His jawline, the tilt of his smile, even the way his eyes seemed to match hers. The pieces she had never thought to assemble were suddenly fitting together. Jonathan felt the room closing in. The murmurs of nearby diners faded into a dull roar in his ears. He wanted to deny it, to dismiss the coincidence, but the evidence was unshakable. He whispered, almost to himself, "Anna." Grace's voice trembled. "You knew her?" The weight of the question was unbearable. Jonathan's throat tightened as he forced himself to meet her eyes. For the first time that evening, the arrogance drained completely from his face. What remained was raw, unguarded humanity. "I loved her," he admitted, the words breaking free like a confession. "But I left. I chose ambition over love, and I never went back." Gasps rippled through the room. A woman at a nearby table clutched her husband's arm. Even Thomas, usually quick with a joke, sat frozen, his fork resting forgotten on his plate. Grace staggered back a step, her hand clutching the necklace tightly. Her breath came fast, shallow. The truth pressed down on her, heavy and disorienting. She looked again at the photograph, then at Jonathan, and whispered, You're saying you were the one?" Jonathan's voice cracked, barely audible. "Grace, I think I am your father." The words echoed in Grace's mind like church bells ringing across the snowy town. "I think I am your father." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She stared at Jonathan Pierce, the billionaire who had just mocked her, who sat surrounded by contracts and wine, and tried to reconcile him with the man in the faded photograph, the man her mother had once loved. Her hands trembled as she clutched the pendant tighter. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "That can't be true." Maggie Collins placed a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. Her voice was steady, yet tinged with sorrow. "Grace, I knew your mother. I knew Jonathan, too. That photograph isn't a trick. It's part of the truth." The young woman's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head, overwhelmed by the sudden weight of the revelation. "All these years, she never told me his name. She just said he was ambitious, that he left before I was born." Jonathan lowered his gaze, shame burning through him. For once, the man who had commanded boardrooms and crushed competitors could not summon a single defense. His voice was hoarse. "She was right. I left. I thought success was worth more than love, and I have lived with that mistake every day, even if I pretended I hadn't." The dining room seemed to shrink around them. Conversations at nearby tables dwindled into silence. People leaned in, openly watching now. Strangers who had come for fine dining and holiday cheer found themselves witnessing the collapse of a man's arrogance and the unraveling of a family secret. Grace's chest heaved. Anger and grief tangled together inside her. She thought of the years her mother had worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. The birthdays spent with only a cake from the grocery store and a whispered story about a man who never came back. She thought of the night she had cried, wondering why she wasn't enough for a father to stay. Tears welled up as she looked Jonathan squarely in the eye. "Do you know what it was like? Do you know what it feels like to grow up watching your mother break her back while you lived in penthouses and signed deals?" Her voice rose, steady and sharp. "You left her. You left me." Jonathan flinched, as though each word were a lash. He wanted to respond, to explain, but there was no explanation that could undo the truth. His eyes glistened, his mask fully gone now. "I can't take it back," he whispered, "but I can beg for forgiveness. Grace, if you are my daughter, please, let me try to make it right." The room was silent, except for the muffled thump of snow hitting the windows. Maggie's eyes shone with sympathy for Grace, yet she didn't intervene. This was no longer her battle to mediate. It was between father and daughter now. Grace's knees felt weak. She wanted to collapse into the nearest chair, to shut her ears against the storm of emotions. Instead, she stood tall, her voice breaking but unyielding. "You have no right to call yourself my father." Jonathan's face crumpled. The man who had once seemed untouchable who had walked into this dining room with power in every step, now sat small, diminished, undone. He gripped the photograph in one hand, the edges trembling as if the paper itself carried the weight of his sins. Around them, whispers spread like wildfire. A diner in a cashmere sweater murmured, "It's his daughter," another added. "He abandoned them, and now it's all coming back." The hum of voices swelled, not cruel, but heavy with judgment and awe. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice breaking. "Grace, I failed you. I failed your mother. But please, give me a chance. Just one chance to prove I can be better." Grace's tears finally fell, streaking down her cheeks. She turned away from him, unable to look at the man who had caused so much absence, so much loss. Her hand hovered near the pendant again, clutching the one piece of her mother she had left. The cliffhanger descended like a hush across the room. Jonathan's voice, raw and desperate, as he whispered, "Grace, please, let me call you my daughter. Just once." Oh, the chandelier sparkled above. But for Grace Turner, the room felt darker than ever. Her breath came fast, shallow, and uneven. The man who had mocked her not an hour ago now sat, claiming to be her father. Every memory of her childhood pressed in on her, the birthdays spent with only her mother, the empty chair at school recitals, the long nights listening to her mother's weary sighs. The bitterness rose like bile. She stepped back, her voice shaking but sharp as she pointed at Jonathan. "Do you know what it felt like, growing up with nothing but questions? Do you know how many times I asked my mother who he was, why he wasn't there, why he didn't love me enough to stay?" Her chest heaved, her words trembling but relentless. "And all this time it was you, sitting in penthouses making millions while we scraped by. You weren't a father. You were a ghost." Jonathan's lips parted, but no words came. His throat tightened. His hand trembled as it gripped the photograph Maggie had laid on the table. For decades, he had built an empire on unshakable confidence. But here, in this moment, he had nothing to defend himself with. His empire of words and numbers crumbled before the raw accusation of a daughter he had never held. The diners watched in stunned silence. The clink of silverware had ceased entirely. A woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin. A man shook his head slowly, murmuring, "Money doesn't fill an empty seat at the dinner table." Grace's tears spilled over, hot against her cheeks. She pulled the serving towel from her apron, the cloth she had carried all night, and threw it onto the table between them. The sound was sharp, final, like the crack of ice in the winter cold. "You have no right to call me your daughter," she said, her voice breaking. Jonathan's heart caved. He reached across the table, his hand brushing the discarded towel, and before anyone could understand, he slid from his chair to his knees. The billionaire CEO, the man whose name graced skyscrapers and hotels, was kneeling on the floor of a dining room, his head bowed in defeat. Gasps swept through the room. Some guests pressed their hands to their mouths. Others simply stared, stunned. Thomas Bradley's face turned pale, his usual smirk replaced by open discomfort. He muttered under his breath, "John, for God's sake, get up." But Jonathan didn't move. His voice cracked, raw and unsteady. "Grace, I can't change the past. I can't bring back the years I stole from you. But please, I'm begging you don't shut the door on me forever." His words echoed, filling the space with a strange blend of shame and hope. Grace's chest ached. For years, she had imagined what it might feel like to meet her father. Sometimes, as a child, she dreamed he would come riding in like a hero, arms open, ready to make up for everything. Other times, she hardened her heart, promising herself she didn't need him. Now here he was, broken, humbled, desperate. And instead of answers, all she felt was pain. The pendant burned cold against her skin. She touched it with trembling fingers, her mother's voice echoing faintly in memory. "Don't let his choices define your worth." Empress. Jonathan raised his head, eyes glistening with tears he no longer tried to hide. He looked not like a titan of industry, but like a man hollowed by regret. "Grace, I was wrong. I chose ambition. I walked away from love, from family, and I have paid for it every day since. Please, let me pay differently now. Let me try to love you." The dining room seemed to shrink into silence once more. The snow tapped gently against the tall windows, the muffled sound of church bells drifting in the distance, marking the hour. Grace turned her face away, her heart pulling in opposite directions, anger and longing, rejection and hope. And though the world watched in hushed awe, she felt utterly alone in the choice before her. Grace turned away from him, her tears falling freely now. She could hardly stand to look at the man kneeling before her, the man who had abandoned her mother, who had left her to grow up with questions instead of answers, with silence instead of love. Every ache of her childhood pressed against her chest, and the wound reopened wider than ever. "You don't get to do this," she said, her voice raw. "You don't get to walk in here, mock me, then suddenly claim you're my father and expect me to forgive you. That's not how life works." Her voice cracked on the last words, and she bit her lip to keep from sobbing. Jonathan's hands trembled on his knees. For years, his hands had signed contracts worth billions, shaken with presidents and investors, commanded empires. Tonight, those same hands reached out like a beggar's, empty, powerless. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he admitted, his voice shaking. "But I can't let this chance slip away. Please, Grace. Let me prove I can be more than the man who left." Gasps rippled through the room. A diner whispered, "That's Jonathan Pierce," begging on his knees. Another murmured, "Money can't buy what he's asking for." Grace pressed her palm against her necklace as though it might shield her. "You broke her heart," she said, her voice trembling. "She spent her life raising me alone. And you—" Her breath hitched, the fury surging again. "You don't get to show up and take credit for the years you ignored." Jonathan's face crumpled. I know," he said, his words tumbling out in desperation. "I can't undo what I did. I can't give your mother back the years I stole. But Grace," he leaned closer, his voice breaking, "don't deny me the chance to know you now. Don't deny me the chance to love you." Her heart wrenched at the word love. It was what she had longed for as a child, the thing she told herself she didn't need but secretly wished for when she blew out birthday candles or sat alone at school concerts. And now it was offered by the very man who had made her childhood incomplete. The necklace seemed heavier on her chest, like an anchor pulling her into the storm of conflicting emotions. She could almost hear her mother's voice. "Grace, forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It opens the door to a future." She shook her head, wiping her tears. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "I don't know if I want to." Jonathan bowed his head, tears falling onto the polished wood floor. His voice was low, pleading. "Then let me earn it. Give me a chance, just one chance to prove I can be the father you never had. Please." The room was silent, but for the faint sound of snow striking the windows, diners stared, some with pity, some with awe, none daring to interrupt. Even Thomas, usually eager to smooth things over, sat stone still, his face pale. Grace looked down at the man who had been larger than life a few hours ago, and now seemed so small, so broken. Her chest ached with rage, sorrow, and the faintest spark of something she dared not name. The cliffhanger fell like a solemn prayer. Jonathan Pierce, once untouchable, remained on his knees, whispering through his tears, "Grace, just give me one chance." The storm outside had thickened. By the time Grace stepped away from the dining room, snow was falling in heavy curtains, piling up along the sidewalks of Aspen. The hotel doors opened, and a sharp gust of cold air rushed in, carrying the muffled toll of church bells from the town square. It was Christmas Eve, and while the streets glowed with holiday cheer, Grace's heart felt hollow. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her breath forming white clouds in the air. She had no destination, only the need to escape the suffocating weight of the dining room, the eyes of strangers who had witnessed her heartbreak. The necklace lay cold against her skin, heavier than ever before. Behind her, the door swung open again. Jonathan Pierce stepped into the snow, his expensive coat already dusted with flakes. For a moment, he simply watched her from a distance, the man who had once stood taller than boardrooms, now looking almost fragile under the winter night. "Grace." His voice carried through the wind, low but urgent. She stopped but did not turn. "Please, don't walk away from me yet." Her shoulders stiffened. "What more could you possibly say?" she asked without facing him. "You've said you're my father. You've begged. But words don't undo years." Jonathan stepped closer, his shoes crunching in the snow. He hesitated before removing his overcoat, a gesture so unlike him it startled even himself. Without a word, he placed it gently around her shoulders. The coat was heavy, warm, smelling faintly of cedar and expensive cologne. But it was the act, not the fabric, that caught her off guard. Grace turned slightly, enough to see his face in the glow of the street lamps. For the first time, his eyes were not cold, not calculating. They were simply tired, raw, filled with a pleading humanity she had never expected to find in him. "I can't erase the past," Jonathan admitted, his breath visible in the frigid air. "But I can start with now. I can start by being here, by putting you before everything else. Not business, not money, just you." The words should have comforted her, but they only deepened her confusion. Grace's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She wanted to believe him, yet every memory of her mother's sacrifices screamed against it. She shook her head, clutching the coat around her as though it might hold her together. "You think one act makes up for everything?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Do you think giving me your coat erases the nights my mother went hungry so I could eat? Do you think it replaces the father I never had?" Jonathan's face crumpled with sorrow. "No," he whispered. "Nothing could ever erase that. But Grace, please, let me try to honor what I failed. Let me try to be what you deserved all along." Snowflakes clung to his hair, his suit, his eyelashes. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a weary man standing in the cold, stripped of everything but his desperation. Grace bit her lip, her tears hot despite the freezing wind. She turned away again, staring down the quiet street where Christmas lights twinkled in shop windows. Families walked by, bundled together, children laughing as they dragged sleds. Each scene pierced her heart, a reminder of everything she had missed. The weight of choice pressed down on her. To turn away would be easier, simpler, to let him vanish as he once had. And yet, some fragile part of her longed to know if he could truly change. Behind her, Jonathan's voice broke once more. "I can't ask you to forgive me tonight, but at least let me walk beside you, just for a little while." Grace stood still in the snow, the weight of Jonathan's coat around her shoulders and the even heavier weight of his words pressing against her heart. She had spent her life building walls, telling herself she didn't need a father, that she was strong enough alone. And yet, the man kneeling to her in that dining room, the man now standing shivering behind her in the cold, was breaking through those walls with the one thing she had never expected from him: humility. She turned slowly to face him. His hair was damp with snow, his breath visible in ragged clouds. For once, Jonathan Pierce did not look like the man from magazine covers or financial reports. He looked like a father, clumsy, desperate, flawed, and uncertain. "Why now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why only after all these years? Why only after she's gone?" Jonathan lowered his gaze, his jaw tight. "Because I was a coward," he admitted. The words scraped his throat, but he forced them out. "I thought chasing success would make me untouchable, that I could bury the guilt. But I was wrong. Every deal, every dollar, none of it kept the loneliness away. Grace, I missed every Christmas, every birthday, every moment that mattered. And the truth is, I don't want to miss another one." The street around them grew quiet as a family passed by, their laughter ringing in the night. A little girl skipped in the snow, her mittened hand clinging to her father's. Grace's eyes followed the scene, her heart aching. She thought of her own childhood, watching other children run into their father's arms while she waited for someone who never came. Her tears fell faster, cutting hot lines down her cheeks. "You don't get those years back," she whispered. Jonathan stepped closer, his voice steady but filled with pain. "I know, but maybe I can give you something now. A father who shows up, even if it's late. A man who chooses family over everything else for the first time in his life." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the snow swirling around them. Grace's heart battled itself, anger against longing, betrayal against hope. She wanted to scream, to run, to curl into the memory of her mother. But part of her also wanted to lean into the possibility that this man, flawed and broken, could still be part of her story. Jonathan saw her hesitation and reached out, not to grab, not to demand, but to offer. His hand hovered in the air between them, shaking slightly, palm open. "Please," he said softly. Just let me walk beside you tonight. That's all I ask. Grace stared at his hand, her breath hitching. Slowly, almost unwillingly, she placed her own hand against her chest, clutching the necklace instead of his. The chain felt like her mother's voice, whispering caution, reminding her of the hurt. She shook her head, tears streaming. "I can't promise anything," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to call you father." Jonathan's lips quivered, but he nodded. "Then I'll wait, for as long as it takes, even if it's forever." The words hung in the frozen air, fragile as the snowflakes drifting down around them. Grace turned her face toward the church bells ringing again in the distance, a reminder that Christmas Eve was nearly over. Families were together, candles were being lit, and hymns were rising into the night. And here she stood, caught between the pain of the past and the fragile thread of a future not yet written. The cliffhanger pressed in gently but firmly. Jonathan, his hands still outstretched, waiting in the snow, while Grace clutched the necklace to her chest, her mother's voice in her heart, and her father's plea echoing in the winter air. Snow blanketed the streets of Aspen through the night, softening the edges of every rooftop and glowing beneath the lamplight. Inside the warmth of the Little Nell, the dining room had emptied, leaving only a few staff clearing tables and the faint echo of carols playing from a speaker in the lobby. But for Grace Turner and Jonathan Pierce, the night was far from over. They sat across from each other at a small corner table now, away from the spectacle of curious eyes. Grace had finally allowed him to sit near her again, though the distance between their chairs still spoke volumes. She held a mug of hot cocoa, her hands wrapped tightly around it as if the warmth could seep into her bones. Jonathan, for once, had no wine glass, no contract folder, nothing but his hands folded on the table, restless and bare. For long moments, they said nothing. The silence was thick, but not hostile, more like a fragile bridge being built plank by plank. Grace's gaze lingered on the pendant resting against her chest. It no longer felt like just her mother's keepsake. Tonight, it had become something more, a key that had unlocked a painful truth she hadn't known she was carrying. Finally, Jonathan spoke, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Your mother, Anna, she was the best person I ever knew. I was too young, too foolish. I thought ambition mattered more than anything, and I lost her because of it. I lost you." Grace's throat tightened. She had waited her entire life to hear those words, but now that they were here, they felt both comforting and cruel. She sipped her cocoa, her eyes fixed on the steam rising above it. "You can't just step into my life and erase what happened," she whispered. "I know," Jonathan admitted. His hands clenched, then loosened, as if struggling not to reach across the table. "I can't erase anything, but I can change what comes next. I can show up. I can be present. If you'll let me." The words hung between them like fragile ornaments, easily broken. Grace wanted to believe them. She thought of her mother's endless nights of hard work, of the loneliness she had endured. Trust did not come easily. And yet, she also thought of the way Jonathan had knelt before her, the way his voice had cracked, the way the crowd had melted away until it was just him begging for one chance. Maggie, who had remained quietly nearby, finally stepped closer. She placed a hand gently on Grace's shoulder, her eyes kind. "He's telling the truth, Grace. He was a fool back then, but I've never seen him like this. If there's ever a time to believe him, it's now." Grace looked at Jonathan again. His eyes met hers not with arrogance, not with entitlement, but with a raw sincerity that disarmed her. He seemed smaller somehow, as though admitting his failures had stripped him of all the armor he had carried. Her lips trembled. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet." Jonathan nodded slowly, the faintest glimmer of hope in his weary expression. "Then don't. Not yet. Just let me be near you. Let me learn who you are. Let me try." Outside, the church bells rang again, calling the town to midnight mass. Families bundled in scarves and mittens passed by the windows, holding candles as they walked toward the chapel. Grace watched them, her heart aching, her eyes misting. She thought of the years of absence, of the man she had hated from afar without ever knowing his face. And now here he was, asking not for her forgiveness, but simply for a chance. Her grip loosened slightly on the cocoa mug. She whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "One chance, that's all." Jonathan exhaled as though he had been holding his breath for decades. His eyes closed briefly, and when they opened, there was a quiet gratitude in them. He didn't reach for her, didn't push further. He simply sat there, a man humbled, holding onto the thread of hope she had just placed in his hands. The bells from the church echoed across Aspen as midnight arrived, their chimes weaving through the snowy air like a hymn. Inside the quiet corner of the little inn, Jonathan and Grace sat together. The silence between them no longer sharp, but tentative, tender. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something fragile and new. Grace traced the rim of her cocoa mug with her fingertip. The steam had faded, leaving only the faint sweetness in the air. Her eyes lifted slowly toward Jonathan. He wasn't looking at her with expectation or demand. He simply watched, waiting, as though every second of her silence was a gift he dared not interrupt. For a man who had spent his life commanding boardrooms and bending others to his will, this was perhaps his first true act of humility, waiting for his daughter to decide who he could be. "I can't promise forgiveness," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears that still glistened on her cheeks. "I can't promise that I'll ever call you Dad, but I can promise this: if you mean what you say, if you show me, not just with words but with your life, then maybe there's a place for you in mine." Jonathan's breath caught. His hands trembled slightly on the table, but his face lit with something he hadn't felt in decades' hope. "That's all I ask," he whispered. "One step at a time. I'll spend the rest of my days proving it to you." Maggie, standing nearby, smiled softly. She placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder, then on Grace's, her voice warm. "This is what second chances look like. Don't waste it." Grace exhaled, clutching the pendant around her neck. For the first time, it didn't feel like only a reminder of what she had lost. Tonight, it also felt like a bridge toward what might still be found. Jonathan stood slowly, uncertain if he should leave or stay. He pulled his coat tighter around himself, forgetting that he had draped his other over Grace's shoulders earlier. She looked up at him, the heavy coat still wrapped around her, and for a brief moment, her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Keep it," he said quietly. "It looks better on you anyway." They both laughed softly, awkward, fragile, but genuine. It was the first sound of shared joy between them, and it felt like the tiniest seed of something that could grow. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the streets in a fresh white blanket. Families streamed out of the church, their voices rising in carols. The sound reached through the hotel's glass walls, wrapping around Jonathan and Grace like a blessing. Grace rose from her chair. For a moment, she hesitated, then extended her hand across the table. Jonathan looked at it as if it were the most precious offer he had ever received. His hand closed gently around hers, not with the grip of control, but with the reverence of a man holding a gift. No words were spoken. None were needed. For the first time in his life, Jonathan Pierce wasn't thinking of profit margins or market expansions. He was thinking only of the fragile hand in his, of the daughter who had every reason to hate him and yet was giving him a sliver of grace. The narrator's voice, if it could be heard, might have said, "Folks, forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but sometimes it opens a door to a new kind of future, one built not on wealth or power, but on the quiet strength of family." Grace squeezed his hand once, firmly, then released it. She stepped toward the lobby doors, pausing to glance back. "Come on," she said softly. "It's Christmas. No one should be alone tonight." Jonathan's throat tightened. He followed her out into the snowy night, where the bells still rang and the streets glowed with warmth. And though the world would remember Jonathan Pierce as a billionaire, he knew that from this night forward, the only title that mattered was the one he still had to earn: father. The snow was still falling when the story came to its quiet end, covering the streets of Aspen in a blanket so white it seemed to erase the tracks of the past. A father who once thought himself too important had been stripped down to humility, and a daughter who carried years of silence finally found her voice. They walked out into that winter night, side by side, not as strangers anymore, but as two people daring to imagine what forgiveness might look like. Friends, maybe you felt the echo of that moment too. It wasn't about wealth or power or reputation. It was about something far simpler, far more enduring. It was about the courage to say, "I was wrong," and the grace to reply, "Maybe we can try again." For many of us, that's the story of life itself. Mistakes made, bridges burned, and the long road of learning how to build them back. If you've lived long enough, you know that families are never perfect. Thanksgiving dinners can hold both laughter and old grudges. A photograph on the mantle can make you smile one moment and ache the next. But this story reminds us that even after decades of absence, a single act of humility can begin to heal what once seemed broken beyond repair. The lesson is simple, yet it rings true like those midnight church bells. Love has the power to redeem. Forgiveness can set us free. Money and titles fade, but a daughter's hand in her father's, a shared smile across a table, those are treasures no fortune can buy. And just like a quilt patched together from scraps, imperfect but warm, a family stitched back together is still a family worth holding close. Think of your own life, perhaps of a Sunday meal where everyone squeezed around the table, or the sound of children playing in the yard. Think of the times someone disappointed you deeply, and the harder times when maybe you were the one who walked away. Stories like this remind us that no matter how far we've drifted, there is always a path home, if we dare to take it. Like the glow of a porch light left on for a traveler, a simple act of kindness can guide us through the darkest streets of our lives. And sometimes, all it takes is the courage to open the door, or the willingness to step inside when it's offered. So tonight, as the snow continues to fall outside your own window, I invite you to let this story settle in your heart. If it touched you, if it reminded you of someone you once loved or someone you hope to forgive, type the number 1 in the comments. If you feel it missed the mark, or if there's something you'd like to add, type 0, because every voice matters here. And if this tale warmed your spirit, consider sharing it, so that another soul who needs reminding may hear it too. After all, the gift of a story is not in how it ends, but in how it lingers, encouraging us to reach out, to forgive, and to love a little more while we still can.